With that introduction, I can't begin to tell you all how special it is for me to be sitting with the first Black senator from the state of Georgia since Reconstruction. And I really want that to sink in. We're talking about 1877, that Black folks in Georgia have had no senator who gave a shit about them. And we're still in that situation in Mississippi. So let me introduce Senator Warnock. He has, for more than 15 years, been the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. That is the Church of Kings. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his father, and his father before him. Am I right about that?
His maternal grandfather.
Yeah. He's a graduate of Morehouse College. He has a PhD from Union Theological Seminary. He's one of 12 brothers and sisters. His two parents were also ministers. And saving what's probably the most important thing for last, he's the father of two wonderful children. And that's not bad for a kid who grew up in public housing in Savannah, Georgia. So, Senator Warnock was elected on January 5th of 2021 in a special election, January 5th, right? We know what happened the next day. And I just want you all to know, because he came in on a special election, he's up for election again this November. So I'm hoping that Georgia is going to send back Senator Warnock to the Senate. Now this memoir is extraordinary, especially it just for itself. It's extraordinary. It tells the story of an amazing journey from that Savannah public housing to the United States Senate. And it's a story about his family and the love in that family that commenced this journey. That doesn't end, but the memoir ends that he is in the United States Senate. And as I read this memoir, I couldn't help but think about Vernon Jordan, another person who spent time here on the vineyard. When Vernon was in Atlanta, he was the director of the Voting Education Project in 1964. And when he left the Voter Education Project, he left it with the slogan, "Hands that pick cotton can now pick our elected officials." And you talk in your book about how your mother picked cotton and how in 2021 she picked you to be her senator. And that, I just can't tell you what that did for me. Now, your memoir gives us this poetic phrase where the spiritual meets the practical. And in addition to the title of your book, that could be the theme song of your life. So what does that phrase say in particular about your entry into the political arena and the values that you bring with you, where the spiritual meets the practical?
Well, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. All right. Listen, it's great to be here. Always great to be back on the vineyard. I've got friends here, and I've been preaching here for years at the First Congregational Church of West Tisbury. my friend Reverend Kathleen Baker sitting there. We went to seminary together, and got another seminary buddy here, Reverend Lorena Parrish, and Reverend Dr. D. Darrell Griffin. We were all in New York together. Make sure you read that chapter, New York State of Mind. Talks about, it was a chapter, a moment in my development and maturation. And the first time I got arrested, standing up in the tradition of what the great John Lewis called good trouble. And so I mean that when I say that the spiritual has to meet the practical. Mine is a faith that gets engaged in the world. It's not a faith that's disconnected, that's disembodied. And I think for me, that's what Christian faith and Judeo-Christian faith at its best, all the great religious traditions, get us engaged in the world. And that's what that title, which comes from the Black church, the title of my book, A Way Out of No Way. You're not in the Black church for more than a few minutes before you're likely to hear somebody, either the preacher from the pulpit or somebody singing in the choir or somebody giving a testimony. You're likely to hear somebody say, God makes a way out of no way. It is a phrase born of struggle and oppression, of pain and keeping the faith even in the midst of that pain. And it's religion made real and strengthened through struggle. And so we have never had the privilege of having a faith that's disconnected from the world. And so it may seem strange to some that a pastor would get involved in something as messy as politics. Let me be clear, I'm not in love with politics. I'm not. I'm in love with change. And I got involved in something as messy as politics with the hope that somehow the things that I've worked on my entire life, I might be able to work on in this arena. And so that's been the arc of my work. This is not my first rodeo at the United States Capitol. I've been there before getting arrested, fighting for health care and fighting for Medicaid expansion. And last year I wrote a Medicaid bill. Same battle, different place.
I appreciate, after reading your memoir, that you have the word transformation in your subtitle. And I want to ask you about what that word means in terms of your relationship with the LGBTQ community. Because in your memoir, you write, it's really the conversion experience that comes from walking with people. Talk about this experience and how this changed what I would call your homophobia before you, I don't know if you would call it that, but just reading your memoir. There was some kind of transformation that went on there.
Sure. I think all of us, for me, and I come from an evangelical Pentecostal faith tradition. And for me, the conversion experience is not just a one-time thing, that we go through a series of conversion experiences. And if we're open, we learn and we grow. And so I came from a typical kind of conservative tradition, in some ways conservative with respect to issues around human sexuality and how you think about that. And part of what happened to me in New York at Union Theological Seminary is that I encountered fellow travelers of the faith who loved God every bit as much as I did, but whose experience was different. And so I talk about my friendship in the book with a woman who lived next door to me. and we became fast friends. I don't want to tell you, you got to read the book.
Yeah, don't give away too much.
But yeah, walking with other folk. And experience, if you're open to it, it'll transform you. I think that applies to human sexuality. I think it applies to gender and identity and race and class. All of us are sitting in this room right now. But even as we sit here, each of us has a unique perspective right in this very moment. We're all seeing something different, in part depending on where we're sitting. Without turning around, you don't see what I'm seeing right now. And I don't see what you're seeing because of where you sit. And that's the importance of experience. And we read the text and we read scripture through a lens and through experience. And if we're open, it transforms us. And it's never as simple as the Bible says. It's not that simple. My faith is informed by scripture, to be sure. But black folk know how oppressive people can be by saying the Bible says. Slaves, obey your masters. It's in the book. But somehow we knew that there was more in the book than that. And so the preacher would preach that same sermon every week based in Ephesians, slaves, obey your masters. And black folk who could barely read somehow stumbled into Exodus where God told Moses to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And so I think if you're open to that, that's the lens through which I've dealt with my own growth with regard also to sexism and patriarchy. Is to think about it in relationship to a contradiction that I know very well, race. And I think the more we talk to one another and we're open with a kind of humility, the more we're open to grow. And that's something I've tried to do with my life.
You know, as I was reading this, transformation just keeps coming up again and again in this journey you've been on. And one of the things you spoke to is a part of my journey right now. I've been talking with political scientist Kathy Cohen, who's helping me with this. But you write about it in your memoir, Respectability Politics. Would you talk about what that is? In your book, you talk about the challenges of dealing with this younger generation who has brought to us a denunciation of what they call respectability politics. And I think you understand what they're doing. Can you share some of that?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I think it's the part in the book where I talk about, again, during my New York years. You ought to read the chapter, New York State of Mind. You hung out over there for a while. Mm-hmm. But I think it was a moment where there was a protest going on, and we were dealing with the issue around hip-hop music and hip-hop culture and so-called gangster rap. And at the time, I was on staff at Abyssinian Baptist Church, and we were dealing with the kind of intergenerational differences about music and certain sensibilities around language and all of that.
Yes, and you wrote, two things can be true at the same time. That was remarkable. I just had to sit with that for a while.
Yeah.
Talk about that.
Well, I was, so at the time, I was a young 22-year-old, 23, somewhere in there, assistant minister on staff and was in seminary. And we were witnessing the emergence of gangster rap at the time. And some of the language was misogynistic. Some of it used the N-word. And so there was a big conversation that was happening within the black community about this. And it was being led by my pastor at the time. We were on staff. You remember this, Reverend Griffin. We were at Abyssinian Baptist Church. And there were folk of the civil rights generation, folks who were a little old, who were offended by all of this. And so there was a big protest led by Reverend Butts at Abyssinian, where the challenge was to, why would you embrace these lyrics, which reinforce some of the most stereotypical views of black life and black culture and sexist, misogynistic. And the point he was making was important. But then there were a group of young folks in Harlem who were also making another important point about the reality of their lives. And they pushed us to not be more offended by the description of the experience than we are of the experience itself. And, so that was an important point. People living in hellish conditions. And in some ways, the music, in all of its nuances, reflects some of that. And that's the issue that folks need to be focused on. So it was an interesting conversation, one that continues to this very day. And it's the reason why in my ministry and in my work, I have always tried to stay in touch with folks on the margins. I think people on the margins can see things that folks who have power can't necessarily see. And I think that applies to race. I think it applies to gender. I think it applies to class. I think that there are things that if there's a truth that is seen by folks who are on the margins. Even Jesus had a moment of growth when he encountered a woman at the margins. Remember, for those of you who went to Sunday school and paid attention, there was this moment where he encounters this woman and she wants her daughter to be healed, her child to be healed. And he recites the orthodoxy. It is not right to take the children's meat and give it to the dogs, after first ignoring her, and the disciples like, leave him alone. And I think she challenges him in a way because she knows some things that only a mother with a sick child knows. And I think she facilitates his growth in that moment and helps him to become who he already was and to deepen his vision of his mission. So that by the time he encounters a Samaritan woman at the well, he's got a broader view. Didn't mean to go to Sunday school. See, it's kind of unusual hearing a senator talk like this, right? But I was a pastor long before I went to the Senate. But it's important to stay in touch with the folks who are at the margins. That's the point I'm making, who are struggling. And that's what my work has been about. And they keep you honest.
Now, in your memoir, you share this vision of the United States as the Freedom Caravan. And you write, it's the Freedom Caravan making stops through history, picking up a new set of passengers at each stop who broaden our understanding of what it means to be a freedom caravan. Now, Bob Moses, who also used to spend some time here before he died, used to talk about U.S. history as expanding, to expand who is included in that phrase, we the people, in the preamble to the Constitution. But right now, we've got over 440 voter suppression laws and proposals out there. We've got a right-wing Supreme Court determined to deliver us to a theocracy and authoritarianism. And it looks like the Freedom Caravan is set to throw some people off. So to situate us further in this presence, I want to bring into the conversation another seasonal resident here on the island, Linda Burnham. And she's just edited a volume that collects from on-the-ground organizers the experiences of the 2020 election, which included your victory. And this volume is called Power Concedes Nothing, subtitle, How Grassroots Organizing Wins Elections. And she reviews all of this work. She gets, some bunch of these people that did that work to actually write about it and capture it so that we can use it this year and in 2024. But this is what she says. So here we are in 2022, and the right-wing authoritarians who lost in 2020 are still challenging the results of that election. Each day they demonstrate their dedication to white minority patriarchal rule. They are playing for keeps. Whether the rich lessons of 2020 are absorbed and put to use by an expanded and more united progressive current in US politics will in no small measure shape the future of democracy. The midterm elections of 2022 and the presidential election of 2024 are shaping up to be pitched battles. So you are currently in one of those pitched battles in Georgia to be reelected to your seat this year. So what's working for you and the future of democracy in Georgia?
Well, America is a sort of freedom caravan, as I talk about. And the beauty and the power of our country is that you have these charter documents, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, this American covenant, e pluribus unum, out of many one. And getting there has been a journey. We hold these truths to be self-evident, Thomas Jefferson said, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And he said all men, not sure he meant all. Said men, maybe he just meant men. But we've seen the expansion of that covenant over time. And it has been hard fought. And there have been expansions and contractions. Expansions and contractions. And my own story embodies that. When I was born in 1969, Georgia had 2 segregationist senators, Talmadge and Richard B. Russell. Talmadge said, "We love the Negro in his place, and his place is at the back door." Well, I sit in his seat. So, Georgia did an amazing thing. Can I talk about Georgia for a little while? Mm-hmm. Because you introduced me as the first black senator from Georgia, and I appreciate that, but folks in northern and other states shouldn't say it like they've achieved it. I'm only number 11 in the whole history of the country. But Georgia did an amazing thing at a moment of deep division in our country. Sent not only its first African-American senator, but its first Jewish senator to the United States Senate. And I think that's important. And I think somewhere in glory, Martin Luther King Jr. and Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel are smiling. Because when they marched alongside one another. Rabbi Heschel said when he marched alongside Dr. King, he felt like his legs were praying. And so that's what we need in this moment. People who put their body in the struggle, pray not only with their lips, but pray with their legs. Georgia did an amazing thing. I knew it was an important race when I got in it. I had no way of knowing that the whole country would be watching in the way that, who could have scripted that? Who would have thought that on November the 4th, 2020, when it looked like Joe Biden would indeed be the president of the United States, who would have thought that we'd still be waiting to see who would have control over the Senate? And what are the chances that you'd need 2 seats for the Democrats to have the majority, and both seats would be in the same state? And if somebody gave the Democrats those odds and said, look, you get the majority, 2 seats, they'll be in the same state, I'll make it easy for you. You get to pick the state. How many of y'all would have picked Georgia? Well, I got the last laugh. Georgia got the last laugh. And Georgia did an amazing thing in one fell swoop. Sent its first African-American senator and its first Jewish senator, at a moment when we've seen the resurgence of a kind of unabashed bigotry, sent us to the United States Senate. And I'll be honest, I felt really good. After a hard-fought battle, some of you wrote postcards, thank you, and made calls, thank you, sent money, thank you very much. And it was an important moment. Next morning, I was talking to everybody. CBS This Morning, Good Morning America, Morning Joe, every morning show. I knew I had arrived because I was on The View talking to Whoopi Goldberg. I was feeling really great, feeling really good that morning, the morning of January the 6th. And by the afternoon, that other and ugly side of our complicated American story had reared its ugly head again. The most violent assault on our capital since the War of 1812. Police officers were brutalized. People literally died. Those folks who marched through the Capitol were not tourists, as some have said. So here's the thing. January 6th happened. And we don't get to pretend that those folk were tourists. We don't get to pretend like it didn't happen. And we don't get to say that that's not who we are. That's too easy. All families have a part of their story that they don't want to talk about, right? You know how it is at your family reunion. There's stuff that you don't want to talk about. It's kind of beneath the surface. Everybody knows about it, or some of the folk know, and you don't really want to talk about it, right? Because that's your uncle. That's, and everybody knows that's your aunt. Everybody knows. And January 6th is part of who we are. And have always been. But guess what? So is January 5th. January 5th is also who we are. In no other place is my story even possible. A kid who grew up in public housing. First college graduate in my family, 1 out of 12 children. Clearly my folks read the Bible, be fruitful and multiply. One out of 12. I'm number 11, first college graduate, and I sit in the United States Senate. That's part of who we are. And so here is where we are. We've got to decide which America we're going to be. Are we going to be the America of January 5th or the America of January 6th? Are we going to give in to the forces of demagoguery and division because folk who have no vision engage in division? They don't know how to lead us, so they're trying to divide us. We're going to give in to that, or are we going to give in to the hope and the promise of January 5th? And I'm not saying it just because I won, but because of what that represents, that diversity of voices that we were talking about, and how that broadens your perspective about what it means to truly be America. And so that's where my patriotism, deep patriotism emerges. I had an older father, and I talk about him in the book. My dad was 52 when I was born. He was born in 1917. I'm now 52. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old. I almost caught him. So he had seen the arc of American change. And I don't want to give up too much, but I talk in the book about how he was asked to give up his seat to a young white teenager on a bus while wearing his soldier's uniform. Because the uniform he was wearing apparently wasn't as important as the skin he was wearing. But my dad never lost hope. He never gave up on America. He had a kind of grit and determination, dogged determination. He was a patriot. And he passed that on to his children. My dad was a preacher and a junk man, literally. Monday through Friday, he picked up old junk cars that other folk had thrown away. And on Sunday morning, the man who had loaded up broken cars, because he saw their value, convinced broken people of theirs. And that's the lens through which I've tried to do my work, both as a pastor and as a senator. So we're in this moment, and I know that folks feel overwhelmed. If we're honest, all of us are going through a kind of PTSD moment. How could we not, after 2 years of a global pandemic that, unlike anything we've ever seen in our lifetime, that created an economic turndown unlike anything we've ever seen, over 1 million American lives lost, and globally so much more, and livelihoods. And now, as we reopen, all the other challenges that folks are dealing with rising costs, all of these things that I'm trying to address in some legislation that I'm trying to push through right now. We're all traumatized. But I would encourage us, I would implore us not to give up. I mean, who am I to give up? I was John Lewis's pastor. And I think about him crossing that bridge with nothing but a knapsack. And what in the world made him think he could win? You ever thought about that? He's crossing the Edmund Pettus Bridge, named after segregationists. What in the world, he and Hosea Williams, what in the world Amelia Boynton, who was gassed on that same bridge, Viola Luiso, a white woman who came down from Michigan, standing up, fighting for voting rights. What made these folks think they could win? Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman. So there he is crossing this bridge. And because I presided over John Lewis's funeral as his pastor, I asked myself the night before, what was he thinking about when he was crossing that bridge? I don't know. Here's what I know he wasn't thinking about. He wasn't thinking that at the end of his life, 3 American presidents would show up at his funeral on both sides of the aisle. That's not why he did it, and he couldn't have imagined that. He wasn't thinking that he'd be the recipient of a Presidential Medal of Freedom. I think he was just trying to stay alive that day so he could fight the next day, with a hope that ultimately he'd be a part of a movement that won. He crossed the bridge, and yet somehow, by some stroke of destiny, mingled with human determination and courage, he crossed a bridge that bridged us into the future. And so we talk about the movement as if those victories were inevitable. They were quite improbable, and yet people kept the faith, they kept pushing, they kept fighting. So who are we to give up in a moment like this? The country goes through expansions and contractions, but even contractions are necessary for birth and new possibility and new promise. So keep pushing. That's what I'm going to do. Keep pushing.
As you're reminding us here, and you discuss this in your memoir, and this is a quote from there, these are no ordinary political times. We are not dealing with a responsible governing party. So I want to ask you for your thoughts on a conversation I've been having with a friend of mine, Mark Linder, out in California. I want to ask you about power. To me, power is the ability to act, but too often liberals seem afraid of power and what it takes to truly act with an undergirding of values. And values without power leads to, wonderful essays and speeches, but not any action or change. Progressives get hung up on perfection, and somehow incremental change becomes a bad phrase. So what are your insights about power coming from your religious background, the church, and your political experiences in Georgia and in the Senate? What is your perspective on power, values, and change?
Well, for me, that's a big question. And let me just answer it in this way. I have a very sober-minded view of power and of human nature. And it's why I believe so deeply in democracy. Democracy, for me, is the political enactment of a spiritual idea. The notion that all of us have within us a spark of the divine. Therefore, we ought to have a voice in the direction of our country and our destiny within it. And part of why I believe so much in democracy is I have a tough-minded, sober-minded view of power, of human nature. In church, we talk about the fallenness of humankind, right? It was theological language. But this idea that human beings have an enormous capacity for love and compassion and for empathy and generosity and justice. But we also have an inclination to protect our own narrow view of self-interest, to be mean-spirited, to be driven by fear more than hope, to engage in a kind of self-aggrandizement personally and collectively as a group. And so you get tyranny and abuse. I think of all human systems, democracy is the best check for that, for tyranny and abuse. The people having a voice. And there are challenges with that too. It's not perfect, right? Because the people don't always go the way we think the people ought to go. But my hope and faith is really is with the people. And if you think about it, all of the power struggles we're having right now, they are at root a democratic problem. We struggle to get progress to the degree that the people's voices have been muted. For example, on gun safety. I'm glad we finally passed something. I know it wasn't perfect. We passed something last week, a couple weeks ago. But we were all sitting on the edge of our seat because we were worried that yet again, because that's been the story literally for 30 years, we were all worried that even after 19 babies were slaughtered in a classroom, that the Senate wasn't going to pass anything. Now, most Americans believe in background checks. 80, 90%. And there's more agreement on the left and the right among American people, ordinary people, than what's been reflected in what we've actually passed in the Congress. Climate change. Ordinary Americans know we got to do something on that. We don't agree on everything, but they agree that we have to have movement. But why is it that you can't get movement on these things? And it is to the degree that the people's voices have been squeezed out of their own democracy through partisan and racial gerrymandering. Politicians have literally played so much with the lines, short-term interests. If I draw the line this way, then I'll win. Folk who are politicians who are more focused on the next election than they are on the next generation. So they draw these crazy gerrymandered lines. And they literally sew themselves up into a bag. Because, we've got an extreme person in my congressional delegation. I don't ever say her name. In Georgia. You know why I don't ever say her name? Because she's irrelevant. I mean that. No. Because if it weren't her, and not just that district. If you know, there's likelihood. The likelihood is people are concerned about somebody even more extreme, and so partisan gerrymandering, voter suppression, dark money in our politics. Most Americans believe that Roe v. Wade should not have been overturned, and yet here we are. So. We got to get the people their voices back and get their vote back. And I have spent much of my career literally registering voters. We do it in my church. And we register voters in my church because I believe that a vote is a kind of prayer for the world that we desire for ourselves and for our children. And then I decided to run to give people somebody to vote for and something to vote for. And so let's keep working at it, because part of the goal of voter suppression, part of the goal of tyranny is to get you to give up. It's to so demoralize you that you feel like there's no reason, there's no hope. And we have to take the long view. I take the long view. I fight with a kind of urgency, but I take the long view. The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. My job is to keep bending the arc. And I don't know when that break will happen. I don't know when we'll get that moment, but we have to keep pushing at it and working at it.
Shall we open up for some questions?
Sure.
I think there's some microphones somewhere, and we'd like to expand the conversation. There's one who just raise your hand and they'll find you. Okay, there's a whole little pod right there.
Hello. I'm Mallory. I worked on your special election race last December/January.
Thank you.
And I think one thing I realized, along with a lot of my colleagues, was that state parties and local democratic infrastructure is so underfunded. And there's this very large disparity between, national levels of power and, the state party in Stone Mountain or the local party in Stone Mountain. So, one, do you agree with that assessment? And two, how do we change the conversation among people in this room and around the country and helping to galvanize and support grassroots infrastructure rather than just, donating to the larger national levels?
No, I mean, what I hear you saying is folks get engaged, and I agree. I mean, at the grassroots level.
No, stay over there.
I've long before I got into, running for office, I was just doing the work, whether it was working on criminal justice reform, mass incarceration, voting rights. But yeah, the change always happens from the bottom up. So I wouldn't wait on these powers that be at this level to fund, it's not up to them. It's not up to them. So thank you for your engagement and the work that you continue to do.
The young woman behind you.
Thank you for calling me young. I'm Priscilla Sims-Brown, Amalgamated Bank. When you mentioned PTSD, you mentioned three significant issues we're all struggling with. Abortion rights, reproductive rights, the travesty of guns killing our babies, something we're all feeling emotional about. There are many more, and we know that these things require a public-private partnership. You can't do it all. And voting is important. I'm sure everybody in this room votes, and I bet you most of the people in this room get somebody else to vote. Talk about the other kinds of activism. Talk about us doing what we can do where we are in other ways.
Yeah, I mean, you are the experts on that, right? Based on where you live and what the issues are where you sit. But I can tell you, when I first I came to Ebenezer Baptist Church in the fall of 2005. And I started in October. Something happened in August of 2005. You might remember it was Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. And that natural disaster revealed the unnatural disasters of racism and poverty still very much with us. Folks knew for years what was going to happen to the old Ninth Ward when that kind of storm hit. And there we saw these Americans captivated. I don't know if you remember, the media started calling them refugees. There's nothing wrong with being a refugee, but that was an interesting moniker for American citizens. And I came in August, and then New Orleans had an election in April. They were scheduled to have an election. Meanwhile, you had Katrina evacuees displaced, I think, to about 30 different states. And they had an election, and they'd provided no way for the folks to vote. Most people would have to come back. And at the same time, we were boasting, 2005, that we had brought democracy, we said, to Iraq. And I said to myself, well, if democracy is good for Iraq, we ought to try it in Louisiana. And so we organized something called the Freedom Caravan, where Ebenezer Baptist Church, just a local church, I know we're a famous church. I promise you we're not nearly as rich as we were, as we are well known. But we decided, I had just arrived. I decided that if Katrina evacuees wanted to go back to vote, we'd take them back. And so we got organized around that. And we took folks who were living in Atlanta from New Orleans who wanted to go back to their hometown to vote. We took them back to New Orleans to vote. And they helped them to have some power. And because no good deed shall go unpunished, when you know it, they had a runoff election, so I had to take them back a second time. And that was my first year at Ebenezer. And every year since then, something has come up, and I discuss it in the memoir, that has kept me engaged and the congregation engaged with making our faith come alive in this kind of grassroots activism that you're talking about. One year we decided, I've been focused on the issue of mass incarceration, which I tackle from the first sentence in the book, you'll see. We decided to address the issue of people having arrest records in Fulton County. There are people all around you in your state some of whom have never been convicted of anything, but they have an arrest record. Some have been exonerated, but there's something out there, a record that keeps them from getting a good job, an apartment, moving forward with their lives. And we approached the officials in our county. We pulled together the law enforcement infrastructure, the public defender's office, the prosecutor's office, the sheriff's department, and we pulled them all together in the fellowship hall of our church and created a movement where folks could come to our church and get their records restricted or expunged in one fell swoop. And it was one of my proudest moments in ministry because I walked in the church that day, sanctuary full of people, several hundred people in church, and everybody sitting in front of me had a record, which if you think about it is true every Sunday. We all have something we're not proud of. We've all had a moment that we wish we could do differently. And we expunged people's records. The first time it was done in kind of one-stop shop. And from that, it expanded, and now it's being done in Fulton County regularly. And then from that emerged a whole movement, and we've been working to focus on this issue of mass incarceration. The land of the free is the mass incarceration capital of the world. We're 4% of the world's population. We warehouse 25% of the world's prisoners. I found a way as a pastor, along with others, to work on that issue and then to expand from there. So you find the thing in the place where you live that gets you involved on some issue and in some way that's bigger than charity, but actually justice making, and see what emerges from that.
We have a question over here from the gentleman with the mic.
Our moderator referenced a thing that Vernon Jordan left when he said, "Hands that pick cotton can pick leaders." I've truncated that. And to my way of thinking, that requires an inner transformation. In your effort to build movements and to create transformation, do you have a stance on transforming consciousness or the inner being of people?
I think those things are mutually reinforcing. I don't think it's one, folks say, well, you're working on the systems, you got to work on the people. And or folks say, well, you work on the people and the people will change the system. No, those things are mutually reinforcing. People are shaped by the systems in which they find themselves. And people design those systems. So, for me, again, pastor speaking, for me, salvation is both personal and social. It's individual, I believe in that, but it's also the transformation of systems. So consciousness is important, but you've got to work on, I think, at all of those levels at the same time. And some people are more gifted at one part of that equation than others, right? So sometimes we're looking for a political answer, and that certainly has its role to play. But when I look at what some of my colleagues are up to, they probably should just sit down and talk to somebody.
There's a question back here. Somebody's got the
No,
mic
I mean that.
back
I mean, there's some other things going on. We got a political analysis, but there's a reason why some people are so angry, and you might need to examine some of that.
Good evening, and thanks so much for being here with us. I'd like to come back from the spiritual to the hardcore practicality of your current election or re-election race. It occurs to me that when Democrats face a tough congressional race, often they will recruit, and run a talented ex-military person. In your tough race, the Republicans have found a black fellow who seems to me to be fairly brainless and a fraudster. Now, when that happened, when he was recruited and is now the candidate, I became afraid that he would get all of the Republican vote and drain some of the black vote from you, and that could spell trouble for you. I've seen various polls. What do things look like to you?
I think that my opponent and I could not be more different, and that the people of Georgia have a stark choice to make about who they think is ready to represent them in the United States Senate. And on that score, I'm proud of the work that I've been able to do, passing the single largest bipartisan infrastructure bill in a generation. We passed the largest tax cut for middle and working class families in American history. It's called the Expanded Child Tax Credit. I would have liked to see us expand it for at least a year. It only went on for 6 months, but we did pass it. Cuts child poverty. We had continued at 40 to 50%. So I'm proud of the work that we've been able to do, and I look forward to having that conversation.
Now, someone has the mic. Who's got the mic?
Yeah, thank you. I don't quite know how to phrase this question, but as a pastor as well as a politician, I know I am very upset at what is passing for Christian behavior. And how do you look at that? How do you come to terms with people who consider themselves Christian?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm struggling that you called me a politician. This woman, this woman asked me. And it's something I was in an airport recently, and a woman recognized me. She wasn't sure why. And finally, she mustered up the nerve. She said, "Are you a politician?" And I said, "I sure hope not. I do serve an elected office, but it's the reason why I go back to my church and preach every weekend. I do that in part because the last thing I want to do is spend all my time talking to politicians. I'm afraid I might accidentally become one. And so this piece on faith, listen, that is an important conversation, and I think when the history of this moment is written, the role that faith has played in this moment, like a whole lot of other moments, will be an important discussion. But my faith is what's driven me into this work. My faith is not a weapon. I don't weaponize my faith to beat other people down. My faith is a bridge, and it causes me to see the spark of the divine in every other human being, and it's channeled me to be engaged in this work. It's the faith passed on to me from my dad and my mom, who had every reason to give in to cynicism and bitterness and fear, and yet they were, sober-minded again about the reality that they were facing, but they kept the faith. And it's the faith of Martin Luther King Jr., who used his voice as a faith leader to redeem the soul of America. And I think we need that voice in this moment. I am not about to cede the territory of faith and values to folks who don't believe in equality. My faith is what causes me to fight for health care.
All right,
And,
we have. Wait.
I've had many things happen. That's different right there. Yes.
Do you have them? And then I'll come to you next, and you'll be the last one. Okay, here you go.
Senator, I appreciate what you've said about faith. And when I grew up in Missouri in the 30s, and through all these years until now, church-going, temple-going, whatever your religion with people, they went to church or whatever their faith was. But now I read in the paper that many people have left their churches, have left religion, or at least it no longer is a part of their daily life. And I wonder if this is affecting the fact that many Americans do not seem to be able to be friends, even though their political beliefs are different.
They're not, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of the question.
Even though their political beliefs, they may be ardent Democrats, ardent Republicans, but they don't seem to be able to be friends anymore. There was a time when senators were friends.
The last part of what you said, I think, is important, relationships. And if you are a person of faith or just moral courage, you ought to be open. It opens you up to building relationships. Strange thing happened when we were passing the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Folks often ask me, what's the most surprising thing that's happened to you since you've been in the Senate? Well, one of the most surprising things is something called the Warnock Cruz Amendment. You said you wanted us to talk to each other, right? So y'all, I knew you all hear me. So yeah, I didn't go on a cruise. The Raphael, Warnock, Ted Cruz Amendment. Ted Cruz and I are both on the Commerce Committee. And most of the time he's talking and I'm sitting there thinking, I know why I get up in the morning and do this job. You get up to do that? I don't, like I'm sitting there, what is it? But as it turns out, there was something that Ted Cruz wanted to get done. And as it turns out, the thing that Ted Cruz wanted to get done, I also wanted to get done. Because of the unique rules of the Senate, I'm sure you've heard about all the rules in the Senate procedure, we weren't able to get it done in committee, so we had to get it done on the floor of the Senate the night we passed the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Ted Cruz made his argument for why he thought we should do this thing. And after he finished, you could only give a brief speech. After he finished, I stood up and it was my turn. And I gave my remarks about why I thought we should get this done. And then I heard myself say words that I never imagined I would say. I said something like, Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like to associate myself with the remarks of the Senator from Texas, Ted Cruz. And the chamber responded about the way you're responding now. And they passed it unanimously. I think half of them weren't absolutely sure what was in it, but they said if Ted Cruz is for it and Raphael Warnock is for it, then we'll let this thing go. And they passed it overwhelmingly. Now, Twitter went crazy. His folk, my folk were like, what's going on? And folk were like, what is it that they could be coming together to do? It's very simple. There's a road that he wants built out in Texas. He just wants to get this road built out in Texas. Interstate 14. Guess what? Same road that would run through Texas runs through Georgia. Right? Same road that runs through Texas runs through Georgia. I'm a Baptist preacher, so I don't know I'm not the moderator, but I'm going to tell you this is the benediction. Same road that runs through Texas runs through Georgia. It runs past communities that are largely red and communities that are largely blue. Communities that are red, yellow, brown, black, and white. Poor people would need to get on that road. Working people would need to get on that road. And the people they work for need to get on that road. Some folk get on that road, they'd be headed to church, some folk to temples, some folk to mosques. Right? Office buildings, recreation centers, all connected. Military bases, part of why we wanted to get it built out in Georgia. Certain parts of our state, all connected by this road, I-14. And I could work with Ted Cruz because I need to get that road built out. And if we get it built out, everybody can get on it. And everybody can get to where they need to go. And so that is how I approach my work, particularly in this divided moment in our country. And there is a road that runs through our humanity that's bigger than politics. It's bigger than the partisan divide and the seeming urgency of what will happen in the next election. There's a road that runs through our humanity that's bigger than race and sexual orientation and identity and gender and class. And my job as a legislator, in ways similar to my job as a pastor, and I think our job as citizens, is to make haste to that road and to try to build it out as best we can, and deal with all the roadblocks that some people encounter trying to get there so that everybody can get to where they need to go. Because I've got 2 little children at home. They're 5 and 3. Their dad's a United States Senator. If you look at the odds, you would think would probably be okay. But I work the way I do because I know that there's a way in which my children aren't going to be okay unless other people's children are okay. And so let's keep building out that road. Keep the faith, everybody. Thanks. Good night.